It was a quiet Tuesday morning when my world first began to crack. I was sitting in my office, nursing my second coffee of the day, when my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from a friend, cryptic and vague. "Hey man, I don't know how to say this, but I think you need to keep an eye on Ella. Something doesn't sit right." I stared at the screen, confused. My wife, Ella, and I had been married for 7 years. She was the last person I'd suspect of anything untoward. We had our challenges, of course. Who didn't? But I always believed our bond was unbreakable. When I got home that evening, Ella was in the kitchen. She looked radiant, humming softly as she prepared dinner. The scene was so normal that I almost convinced myself to ignore the nagging thought that had been plaguing me all day. But then, I saw it. A small, barely perceptible change. Her smile was there, bright as ever, but her eyes avoided mine when I stepped closer. Something was off, but I couldn't quite place it. "How was work?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Same old," she replied, stirring the pot in front of her. "What about you?" I wanted to say it. I wanted to blurt out the text, to confront her right there, but I hesitated. Was I overthinking? Was I just being paranoid? Later that night, as Ella slept soundly beside me, I picked up her phone. I hated myself for it, but the seed of doubt had already taken root. I had to know, and that's when I saw it. A string of messages from a contact saved as Paul Trash Pickup. The messages were explicit, intimate, more damning than anything I could have imagined. And there it was. Ella had been cheating on me, not with a coworker or an old flame, but with a garbage man. My head spun. A wave of nausea hit me like a truck. I staggered to the bathroom, my chest tight, my vision blurred. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Not Ella. Not us. I sat on the cold tile floor, staring at the phone in my hand, my mind racing. I thought back to every late night, every odd excuse. The moments that hadn't added up, they all rushed back like a tidal wave. But the messages weren't the worst part. In them, she laughed at me, called me predictable, safe, weak. I couldn't breathe. For the first time in my life, I didn't know who I was anymore. The next morning, I went about my routine as if nothing had changed, but inside, I felt like a ghost moving through the shell of my life. Ella greeted me with her usual warmth, kissing my cheek as she prepared my coffee. I fought the urge to pull away, her touch now feeling foreign, almost repulsive. "Got a busy day?" she asked, her tone cheerful. "Yeah, a lot of meetings," I replied, barely looking up from my phone. My voice came out flat, but she didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she just didn't care. Every moment I spent around her felt like a slow-burning torture. Her laugh, her smile, her small touches, they all seemed like weapons now, cutting deeper with every interaction. I wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but something held me back. I needed to be smart about this. I couldn't afford a rash confrontation. Instead, I spent the day unraveling the threads of her betrayal. While Ella was at work, I accessed our shared laptop. If she thought I wouldn't dig deeper, she didn't know me as well as she thought. I combed through her email, her social media, and anything else I could find. At first, it seemed clean. Too clean. But then I stumbled upon a hidden folder buried within the depths of our cloud storage. Photos, videos, messages. The evidence was overwhelming. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was documenting it. Pictures of them together in places I recognized. Our park. The diner we frequented on Sundays. The worst was a video of them in our car. My car. She was laughing, tossing her hair the way she always did when she was happy. Only, it wasn't me who made her laugh this time. It was him, Paul. I looked him up next. His profile was a mishmash of mundane posts about sports, beers, and nights out with friends. There was nothing remarkable about him. Nothing that could explain why Ella would risk everything for him. And yet, she did. By the time Ella came home that evening, I had seen enough. But I still wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. Instead, I watched her closely. I noticed things I hadn't before. The way her phone was never out of her reach, how she turned away slightly when she typed. When she said she was running to the store for groceries, I checked the app we used to track our shared accounts. Sure enough, there was a purchase at a gas station far from any grocery store. Later, I checked her location. She wasn't at the store. She was parked at an industrial lot, the same one used by the city's waste management services. She came home an hour later, smiling as if nothing had happened. The audacity of it all was infuriating. She kissed my forehead before disappearing into the shower. I stood in the hallway, her laughter echoing faintly over the sound of running water. My reflection in the hallway mirror looked back at me, hollow and unrecognizable. I knew I couldn't let this slide, but revenge would take planning. The following days felt like walking on broken glass. Every interaction with Ella was a minefield, each smile or touch reminding me of the betrayal she thought I hadn't discovered. But I held my tongue, channeling my anger into planning. If she thought I was weak, I'd prove just how wrong she was. First, I needed to protect myself. I contacted my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Grace who had handled some business contracts for me in the past. I didn't tell her everything, just enough to make her understand I needed a post-nuptial agreement. Grace raised an eyebrow but didn't pry. "If this is about infidelity, we'll need evidence," she said. Evidence. That part was easy. That evening, as Ella slept beside me, I downloaded everything from her phone and laptop. Photos, videos, messages, all copied to a secure drive. I even recorded her recent location history, showing her frequent visits to the industrial lot. I knew I'd need every scrap of proof when the time came. The next step was hiring a private investigator. Rodney was an old friend of mine from college who had gone into the business after years in law enforcement. When I explained the situation, he didn't look surprised, just sympathetic. "You're not the first guy to call me about this kind of thing," he said. "But trust me, you'll want to wait for the right moment before making your move." Waiting was the hardest part. Ella's behavior grew bolder as days passed, her lies becoming more blatant. One evening, she told me she was meeting a friend for drinks. Instead of staying home, I decided to follow her. Parking a safe distance away, I watched as she pulled into a small bar on the outskirts of town. Minutes later, Paul arrived. They greeted each other with a kiss, the kind of kiss that used to be mine. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced with the weight of what I was seeing, but I refused to act on impulse. Instead, I snapped a few photos and drove home. The feeling of betrayal burned, but I reminded myself that revenge was best served cold. In the following weeks, Rodney kept me updated. He tracked Ella's rendezvous with Paul, documenting everything in meticulous detail. They met at parks, in parking lots, even at his home. Rodney even obtained video footage from the bar's security cameras, showing Ella and Paul together. Every piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of the life she thought she had. But it wasn't just about gathering proof. I needed to think bigger, beyond just ending our marriage. Ella and Paul had stolen my trust, my dignity, and my peace of mind. They laughed at me, called me weak. That wasn't something I could forgive. No, when the time came, I wouldn't just walk away. I'd make sure they regretted ever underestimating me. Despite the storm raging inside me, I maintained the facade of a devoted husband. Ella had no clue that her betrayal had been uncovered. She carried on as if nothing had changed, while I played my role with precision, never letting her suspect that the foundation of our marriage had already crumbled beneath her. One evening, she sat across from me at the dinner table, twirling spaghetti on her fork. "Work was exhausting today," she said casually, her tone carrying the same ease it always had. "Jenna is driving me insane with all her last-minute changes." "Sounds frustrating," I replied, keeping my voice calm. Inside, I marveled at her audacity. Did she think I was that clueless? Every word she spoke felt like a thin layer of paint over a rusted truth. After dinner, I excused myself, retreating to the office where I kept my growing collection of evidence. The folder on my computer labeled Life Raft had ballooned to include dozens of photos, videos, and transcripts. Rodney's latest report was particularly damning. He had managed to capture audio of a conversation between Ella and Paul, discussing plans to eventually come clean, but only when it would make sense for them. "She's waiting for the right time," I muttered to myself, staring at the transcript on my screen. Well, so am I. The days turned into weeks, each one sharpening my resolve. I began to make subtle adjustments to our financial arrangements. I closed unnecessary joint accounts, claiming we needed to save for a big surprise. I consolidated assets into accounts solely under my name, carefully ensuring everything was above board. Grace, my lawyer, worked discreetly on the postnuptial agreement, which I planned to present at the perfect moment. Ella, oblivious, continued her double life. One Saturday morning, she told me she was meeting some friends for brunch. Instead of challenging her, I kissed her goodbye and said, "Have fun." Moments later, Rodney texted me. "She's heading to Paul's house." It wasn't just anger fueling my actions anymore. It was strategy. The more she lied, the more ammunition I collected. I began planting seeds with our mutual friends, casually mentioning Ella's busy schedule or her new hobbies. I didn't accuse her of anything outright. I simply let people draw their own conclusions. Subtle, quiet, but effective. In the evenings, I started reconnecting with old friends, something I hadn't done in years. It wasn't about making Ella suspicious. It was about building my own life back up, brick by brick. I'd been so focused on our marriage for so long that I'd lost sight of who I was outside of it. If this was going to end, I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to thrive. One night, as Ella slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind running through every detail of my plan. The moment to strike was drawing closer. The calm before the storm was nearly over. And when it hit, Ella and Paul would never see it coming. It was a crisp Friday evening when the first crack in Ella's perfect little charade finally showed. She was in the kitchen, texting furiously while pretending to prepare dinner. I watched her from the doorway, unnoticed, as her lips curved into a small, secretive smile. That smile, so familiar yet now entirely foreign, ignited a spark of anger I had to suppress. "Who's got you smiling like that?" I asked casually, stepping into the room. My voice was light, teasing, as if I didn't already know the answer. She jumped slightly, startled, then laughed nervously. "Oh, just Jenna. She sent me a meme about work. You know how she is." I nodded, pretending to buy her excuse. "You should show me." I could use a laugh. Her fingers tightened around her phone for a split second before she tucked it into her pocket. "Maybe later," she said with a shrug, turning back to the stove. The tension in her shoulders gave her away. She knew I'd caught her off guard, and that small victory tasted sweet. Over dinner, I observed her more closely than ever. Every glance at her phone, every absent-minded response to my questions, felt like another brick in the wall separating us. It was maddening how she continued to act as if nothing had changed. But I let her keep her delusions, knowing that the real reckoning was approaching. That night, I reviewed the day's updates from Rodney. His latest report detailed a meeting Ella had with Paul that afternoon at a cafe downtown. She had left work early under the pretense of a team-building exercise. There were photos of them sitting close, heads tilted together in conspiratorial whispers. Paul's hand lingered on hers across the table. Ella's laugh lit up her face in a way I hadn't seen in months. The bitterness in my chest grew heavier with each image. I scrolled through the rest of Rodney's file, noting the timestamps and locations. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. The thought of her flaunting their relationship so brazenly lit a fire in me that no amount of calm planning could douse. But then, as I scrolled to the last photo, an idea sparked. Ella wasn't just lying to me. She was lying to everyone. Her friends, our families, even Paul. I realized then that I didn't just want to end this charade. I wanted to expose her for who she truly was. Every mask she wore, every layer of deceit, would come crashing down. The next day, I began laying the groundwork for what was to come. A quiet conversation with our mutual friends here, a casual mention of strange behavior there. People started asking questions. Not many, but enough to make Ella squirm as whispers began to reach her ears. And as I watched her try to hold it all together, the satisfaction I felt confirmed one thing. Her downfall wouldn't just be swift, it would be spectacular. She thought she could keep lying forever. She had no idea the truth was about to come out. The whispers began to spread faster than I anticipated. A subtle comment here, a pointed glance there. It was all I needed to stoke the embers of suspicion in those around us. Ella noticed. I could see it in the way she clung tighter to her facade, smiling more broadly, laughing a little louder. But beneath it all, her confidence was starting to fracture. "What's wrong?" she asked me one evening as we sat watching television. Her voice had an edge, a nervousness that hadn't been there before. "You've been distant lately." Distant? It was ironic, considering she was the one sneaking around, but I couldn't show my hand yet. "Work stress," I replied, forcing a tired smile. "Nothing to worry about." She stared at me for a moment, as if trying to gauge whether I was telling the truth. Finally, she nodded and leaned back against the couch. "Let me know if you want to talk about it." I turned my attention back to the screen, but I wasn't really watching. I was too focused on the unraveling threads of our life. The once sturdy fabric of our marriage was fraying fast, and soon it would snap. The next morning, I noticed her on the phone as I came into the kitchen. Her voice was low, conspiratorial, as she whispered into the receiver. I know, but he's been acting weird. I think he suspects something." My footsteps made her whip around, and she hung up abruptly, plastering on a strained smile. "Morning, love," she said, far too brightly. "Morning," I replied, feigning ignorance. "Who was that?" "Oh, just Jenna," she said quickly, brushing past me to grab her purse. She wanted to talk about work stuff. Jenna again. If Jenna knew how often she was being used as a scapegoat, she'd probably laugh. Or maybe punch Ella in the face. As she left, I made a call of my own. Rodney answered on the first ring. "She's feeling the heat," I told him. "I need you to tail her more closely now. If she's slipping, I want every moment of it documented." "You got it," Rodney replied. "By the way, you might want to check your shared credit card account. She made an interesting purchase last night." I logged in immediately after hanging up, my blood boiling as I saw the charge. A jewelry store. She had spent nearly $500 on a gift, one I certainly hadn't received. The gall of her, using our money to buy something for him, was almost comical in its audacity. That evening, Ella seemed on edge. She barely ate dinner and spent most of the night pacing around the house, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. I didn't push her. The more she stewed in her own paranoia, the more careless she would become. By the time she finally went to bed, I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her. The cracks in her perfect little world were growing wider by the day, and soon, everything she built on lies would come crashing down. The turning point came unexpectedly, as most pivotal moments do. It was a Saturday afternoon when I received a message from Rodney. "You're going to want to see this. Check your email." Curiosity burned as I opened my inbox. Rodney had sent a video attachment along with a brief note. "Captured this outside Paul's place yesterday. It's the leverage you've been waiting for." I played the clip. The shaky but clear footage showed Ella stepping out of her car in a tight black dress I'd never seen before. She smoothed her hair, glancing around nervously before heading toward Paul, who stood waiting in the driveway. The two exchanged a passionate kiss before retreating inside his modest home. The timestamp showed it was midday, a time when she was supposedly shopping for the kids. My stomach churned, but anger quickly overtook any lingering heartbreak. She wasn't just cheating. She was spitting on everything we'd built together. I forwarded the video to Grace with a simple instruction. "Prepare to use this." That evening, Ella came home, humming softly as she carried a small bag from a boutique I knew she rarely shopped at. I played it cool, asking her about her day while hiding the rage bubbling beneath the surface. Her lies came smoothly, as though she'd rehearsed them. "Just got some clothes for the kids. Want to see?" "Maybe later," I replied, forcing a smile. "I trust your taste." Her confidence returned in an instant, bolstered by my apparent obliviousness. But my own confidence grew too, knowing I had finally pulled the first thread in her web of lies. The next day, I made my move. It started with a group text to a few mutual friends, framing it innocently enough. "Hey, has anyone seen Ella and Jenna lately? Ella keeps saying she's spending time with her, but Jenna's been hard to reach. Just worried something's up." The responses came quickly, each one fueling my plan. "I saw Jenna at the grocery store this week. She mentioned working a lot of late shifts, but I don't think Ella's been with her." "Wait, didn't Jenna just post about being out of town?" That's odd. The seeds of doubt were planted. It wasn't long before Ella noticed the shift. At a dinner party with friends later that week, people's smiles seemed tighter, their questions sharper. "How's Jenna doing?" someone asked innocently. Ella stumbled through her response, her laugh forced, her answers vague. That night, as we drove home, Ella was unusually quiet. "Everything okay?" I asked, feigning concern. "Yeah, it's just been a long day," she mumbled, staring out the window. But I knew better. The cracks in her world were widening. Her confidence wavered as the weight of her own lies pressed down on her. And this was only the beginning. When we got home, I kissed her goodnight as she went to bed. Then I sat in my office, watching the video of her and Paul again. The first blow had landed, and it was time to prepare the knockout punch. Ella's veneer of confidence began to chip away faster than I anticipated. She grew jumpy, her phone never leaving her side, and she often glanced at me with suspicion when she thought I wasn't looking. It was almost amusing. How the woman who had confidently juggled lies now seemed like a performer forgetting her lines. One evening, while she scrolled through her phone on the couch, I sat beside her and asked casually, "Hey, have you talked to Jenna lately? I've been meaning to thank her for the great meme collection she's apparently sending you." Her face froze for a split second before she recovered, her laugh forced. "Oh, you wouldn't get them. They're all inside jokes from work." I smiled. "Try me." She quickly changed the subject, but her hands were shaking slightly as she set her phone down, screen face down. Another misstep, another crack in the wall she was so desperate to keep intact. That night, after she went to bed, I picked up her phone. She'd changed her password, of course, a minor annoyance. I didn't need it, though, because I had something better: Rodney's daily updates. That same day, he had followed Ella to a jewelry store downtown where she spent over half an hour browsing. His photos showed her leaving with a small bag, the kind that usually carried something significant. The next photo was even more damning. Ella arriving at Paul's house later that evening. She hadn't just bought jewelry, she'd given it to him. The image of her standing on his doorstep, holding that small bag with a smile so radiant it twisted my stomach, told me everything I needed to know. The next morning, I decided to push things further. Over breakfast, I asked, "You didn't bring anything home from the boutique the other day. Was it something for you?" She stiffened. "Oh, no, it wasn't anything big. Just something for a coworker's birthday." I raised an eyebrow. "Which coworker?" "Jenna," she blurted out without thinking. "Funny," I said, my voice calm but pointed. "Because Jenna's been out of town. That's what her Instagram says, anyway." Her eyes widened, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, no, I meant Natalie. I don't know why I said Jenna. It's been a long week." "Right?" I said, letting the silence stretch between us. She fidgeted under my gaze before mumbling an excuse about being late for work and leaving the table. As soon as she was gone, I called Grace. "We're moving forward. I want everything ready." She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. With Rodney's latest reports in hand, I forwarded her the evidence, each file carefully labeled and time-stamped. Photos of Ella with Paul, transcripts of their texts, receipts for the jewelry. All of it painted a clear picture. Ella thought she was still in control, that she could lie her way out of any situation. What she didn't realize was that I'd been pulling the strings all along. The web was tightening, and she was running out of places to hide. It was a quiet Thursday evening when I decided it was time to begin unraveling Ella's illusion of control. She came home late again, the excuse this time being that her coworker Natalie needed emergency help with a project. I didn't press her on it. Why would I, when I already knew the truth? Instead, I waited until dinner was over and the kids were asleep. As she tidied up in the kitchen, humming softly, I called her into the living room. "Ella, we need to talk," I said, my tone serious but calm. The words were a trap, baited with just enough tension to catch her attention without raising suspicion. She turned, an uneasy smile flickering across her face. "Sure. What's on your mind?" I gestured for her to sit, and for a moment, she hesitated. Her reluctance to meet my gaze was telling. She knew, on some level, that her carefully constructed world was in danger of collapse. But still, she sat, folding her hands tightly in her lap. I've been feeling like things have been off between us lately, I began. You've been distant, distracted. Is there something you want to tell me? Her eyes darted to the floor. No, of course not. It's just work stress. You know how it is. I nodded slowly, as if considering her words. Right. Work stress. That makes sense. And the jewelry you bought? Was that to help with work stress too? Her head snapped up, her expression frozen between shock and indignation. What? What jewelry? The bag you brought to Paul's house, I said, letting the name hang in the air like a grenade waiting to detonate. Ella's face turned pale, her carefully rehearsed lies collapsing under the weight of my knowledge. What are you talking about? I didn't. I cut her off, my voice sharper now. Don't insult my intelligence, Ella. I've been patient. I've been watching. I know everything. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Her mouth opened and closed as if searching for an explanation, but no words came. I leaned forward, my gaze locked on hers. You're seeing Paul, I said flatly. You've been lying to me, to our kids, to everyone. And I have proof, photos, videos, text messages. I even know about the jewelry. Her lips trembled, her voice barely above a whisper. How long have you known? Long enough, I replied, the weight of my words sinking into her like stones. Long enough to know that you've made a mockery of this marriage, and long enough to have prepared for what happens next. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. She reached out, as if to touch me, but I leaned back, out of her reach. Don't, I said coldly. You don't get to cry now. You don't get to pretend you're the victim. For the first time in weeks, Ella had no response, and I realized, as her silence stretched, that this was only the beginning of her unraveling. The silence between us felt like an abyss. Ella sat motionless, her face pale and streaked with tears that she wasn't bothering to wipe away. Her usual composure was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability I hadn't seen in years. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. Please, let me explain, she said finally, her voice hoarse. I leaned back, crossing my arms. By all means, Ella. Explain to me how lying to my face, sneaking around with another man, and spending our money on him fits into the life we've built together. Go ahead. I'd love to hear it. She flinched at my words, her fingers gripping the edge of the couch as if it might anchor her to the crumbling ground beneath her. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she said quietly. Paul, he was just a distraction. It didn't mean anything. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that startled even me. Didn't mean anything? You kissed him in broad daylight. You bought him jewelry. You risked our marriage, our family, for something that didn't mean anything? Do you even hear yourself? She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop her. No. No more lies, Ella. I've seen the photos. I've read the messages. You didn't just have an affair. You built a whole life with him. A life that didn't include me. The mask of remorse she was trying to wear cracked under the weight of my words. I was lonely, she snapped, her tears replaced by anger. You were so busy with work, with the kids, with everything else. I felt invisible. Invisible? I shot back, my voice rising. Do you think I wasn't lonely too? Do you think I didn't feel the distance growing between us? But I didn't turn to someone else. I didn't betray you. She looked away, her jaw tightening. You don't understand. You're right, I said, standing abruptly. I don't understand. I don't understand how someone who swore to love me could do this. I don't understand how you could humiliate me like this. Ella jumped to her feet, desperation flashing in her eyes. I made a mistake, she pleaded. A terrible mistake, but I can fix this. We can fix this. I shook my head slowly. No, Ella. You don't fix something like this. You made your choices, and now you get to live with the consequences. Her tears started again, and she reached for me, but I stepped back, the space between us feeling as vast as the betrayal that had brought us here. I trusted you, I said quietly, my voice heavy with finality. I loved you, and you threw it all away. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice trembling. I met her gaze, cold and unyielding. You'll find out soon enough. Her sobs echoed through the room as I walked away, leaving her alone with the weight of what she'd done. The confrontation was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. I didn't sleep that night. As Ella lay in the bed we'd shared for years, her muffled sobs filling the room, I stayed on the couch, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of her movements upstairs. It was surreal. This was the same woman I'd once thought was my soulmate. Now, she felt like a stranger. By morning, I was resolute. The time for planning was over. It was time to take back control. I started the day with a call to grace. "File the paperwork," I said, my voice steady. "I want it served today." She didn't ask questions. Within hours, Ella would be holding the divorce papers in her hands, every detail meticulously outlined. Joint assets frozen. Custody arrangements proposed. My evidence of her infidelity attached. There was no room for negotiation. Ella would walk away with nothing but the guilt she'd earned. While I waited for the papers to be served, I went about dismantling the rest of her safety net. Rodney had sent me Paul's full background the week before, and I'd been sitting on it, biding my time. Now, I forwarded it to Paul's employer, an anonymous tip exposing his shady dealings. Ella's distraction wasn't just a garbage man. He had a history of petty theft and a suspicious gap in his work history that suggested more. By midday, Ella was served. She came storming into the living room, the papers clutched in her trembling hands. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "You know exactly what it is," I said, not bothering to look up from my laptop. "It's the consequences of your actions." "This is insane," she shouted. "You can't do this to me." I finally met her gaze, my calm a stark contrast to her fury. "You did this to yourself, Ella. I'm just making it official." Her protests grew louder, her pleas more desperate. But I was done listening. I walked out of the house, leaving her alone with the weight of her choices. Over the next few days, Ella's world began to unravel. The bank called to inform her that our joint accounts had been frozen. The credit card company followed suit. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, some offering sympathy, others demanding answers. And then there was Paul. He'd been fired from his job, his reputation shredded by the revelations I'd sent to his employer. Ella tried to reach him, but he stopped answering her calls. Rodney confirmed he'd left town, disappearing as quickly as he'd entered our lives. Meanwhile, I was rebuilding. I focused on my work, throwing myself into projects that reminded me of the man I used to be before Ella's betrayal consumed me. I started seeing old friends again, reconnecting with people I'd neglected in my pursuit of salvaging a doomed marriage. Ella spiraled. Without Paul, without money, and without a lifeline, she became a shadow of the confident woman she once was. She begged me for another chance, swearing she'd do anything to make things right. But there was no going back. "I trusted you once," I told her, "and you betrayed me. Trust isn't something you can rebuild with promises." She moved out shortly after, taking only what little she could carry. I let her keep the car, more as a gesture for our children than for her. I knew it wouldn't be long before it was repossessed anyway. Once Ella was gone, the house felt lighter. I redecorated, removing every trace of her. The kids adjusted surprisingly well to the new arrangements, their resilience giving me strength. I kept things civil for their sake, but my interactions with Ella were strictly limited to logistics. As for me, I started to thrive again. I joined a gym, took up hobbies I'd long abandoned, and even dipped a toe into dating. The confidence I thought I'd lost returned, piece by piece, with every small victory. Months later, I received an email from Rodney. Attached was a photo of Ella, sitting alone in a dingy cafe, her hair unkempt, her eyes hollow. She looked nothing like the vibrant, self-assured woman I once knew. "She's hit rock bottom," Rodney wrote simply. I stared at the image for a long time, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, sadness, relief, but mostly a profound sense of closure. I didn't reply to Rodney. Instead, I deleted the email and went back to my life. Ella's downfall was her own doing, and I had no interest in gloating over her misery. I'd moved on. I'd rebuilt. And for the first time in years, I was truly free.